everyone. I'm Kevin Davies, executive editor of the CRISPR Journal and the new journal Gen Biotechnology, published by Marianne Liebert, coming out very soon, a new marquee journal covering all aspects of biotechnology. We're very excited about it, and we hope you'll check it out. I'm also the author of Editing Humanity, the CRISPR Revolution and the New Era of Genome Editing, out now in paperback. In this session of the RFS annual meeting, we're going to pay tribute to the great Rosalind Franklin herself with really an ideal guest, a fellow author and, more importantly, distinguished professor of the history of medicine at the University of Michigan Medical School, Howard Markel. Howard is the author of multiple books, the most recent of which, and the one we'll spend most of our time discussing today, is The Secret of Life: Rosalind Franklin, James Watson, Francis Crick, and the discovery of DNA's double helix. And Howard joins us from Ann Arbor, where I believe the room where he wrote the book. Howard, a warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight.
Congratulations again on the publication and the great reviews that you've been receiving on The Secret of Life. This is very, the saga of 1952, 1953, and Rosalind Franklin's role. This has been captured in many books. I'm curious, first off, what drew you to this project?
Well, of course, I had read as a 18-year-old, I still have the copy somewhere, of the double helix, and I responded to it in the late 1970s, as a typical 18-year-old American boy would. I snickered and laughed inappropriately, as I might, because there's these clear villains and clear heroes in that book. And of course, young aspiring researchers, and I was one of them, all dreamed of discovering their own double helix. So that book was very important, although it has a lot of problems and issues. Well, fast forward many, many years, I was here at Michigan for a while, and I always wanted to teach a course called Great Papers, where we would take some important paper in the history of medicine and take it apart, look at it, and try to get the context of who wrote it and what. So the first paper was that 870-odd word paper on April 28, 1953, of the double helix that Watson and Crick wrote, that did not have a scintilla of data. It was all theory. And it had a really, as you know, everyone knows, kind of a false acknowledgement that we, benefited, but we didn't really see their data. And of course, it matched what was photograph 51, as Rosalind Franklin wrote in her paper with Ray Gosling in the same suite of papers. Of course, it matched their model because it was based on that photograph number 51. So I had about 70 or 80 students come for this first session. And that's not common, even when I serve lunch. And it just struck me, how much interest there was in this paper. And of course, it's one of the bedrocks of modern biological science. So I started reading more and more about it. I have two daughters. One is 21 and about to be a senior at Swarthmore, and the other is a junior in high school. And they all said, you got to write about this. And I've written about epidemics. I've written about Kellogg brothers and alternative medicine. I've written about addiction and Sigmund Freud. But I said, as a historian, well, girls, we have to look at the data. We have to see what's there, who left what, and see what happened. So I try to go, as I usually do when I am doing historical work. I mean, objectivity, one famous historian wrote, is like nailing jelly to a wall. We all carry our own biases and so on. But I wanted to look at all the data, all the oral histories, because it was so well traveled and these people were so frequently interviewed, and there are so many archives that hold those interviews. Even though several of them had long since passed away, I still had wonderful data that wasn't used in any of the books. And of course, I spent about a week with James Watson, interviewing him. And I spent some wonderful sessions with Jennifer Glynn, who is Rosalind Franklin's younger sister. She's now 92. She lives in Cambridge. I met her when she was 90 a few years ago. And I long to hand her an autographed copy of this book. I am supposed to be a visiting professor at Cambridge University in a few weeks to start. I actually delayed it last term. So I'm hoping to be able to hand deliver.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Your publisher has a wonderful line. It says, "The Secret of Life," your book, is a story of genius and perseverance, but also a saga of cronyism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, and misconduct. I mean, what more could you want?
I know. I love writing about conflict, particularly in other people's lives, not in my own. But yeah, this one has a lot of conflict. Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, I don't suppose you go into a project like this without sort of reading the biographies of Rosalind Franklin that have come out over the last few decades, especially Brenda Maddox's classic biography, Rosalind Franklin, The Dark Lady of DNA. I'm curious what your impression of these books was, and did you set out in your own research to were you looking to uncover new nuggets, new perspective on not just Rosalind but everybody?
Yes, whenever you're a serious historian, you don't want to just write other people's work. You want to mine in the archives and see if you can revise a story based on new information. For example, there's a chapter on Naples when Watson met Wilkins. That's all new stuff. No one had ever gone to the Naples Zoological Station, which is still there and has a tiny little dusty archive, to dig that stuff out. So that was incredible. There are many other sets of papers and interviews that I found along the way. And of course, you read all the autobiographies. So each of the participants, save Rosalind, wrote their own autobiography. And, autobiography or memoir, as some of my friends call it, is potentially fiction. Many of the critics of Watson's colleagues, friends of his, Crick, called it a novel, not an autobiography. So that's telling.
Yeah.
And certainly so does Jennifer Glynn. And Rosalind was already dead by that time, but her mother was terribly hurt by the publication and even said many times, I wish she had never been remembered at all. Probably everyone in this room or this virtual room knows that, than being remembered in that way. But there are also a lot of secondary accounts by people who were not cronies, but they had to get in good with the various participants when their papers were still their papers, as opposed to being at the Wellcome Library or American Philosophical Society. So there's some very fine books there, but and I don't want to suggest people were co-opted, but we all have that. That's a risk when you're an interviewer, especially when you're interviewing a major whale like Francis Crick or James Watson. And these guys were and James Watson still is, very charming and funny. And even, he's 92, 93 and had a very serious head injury a few years ago. He's still fascinating, but you have to be careful not to be seduced as you interview those people. So basically it was as exhaustive as I could make it as a 61-year-old man with a bad back and bad eyes.
Were there other, you've already alluded to insights and resources and sources of information that perhaps haven't been tapped before. What other places or archives did you find particularly valuable where you've perhaps found some really useful gems of material?
Well, one of the things I mentioned Brenda Maddox's book, which is just superb.
Yeah.
And she was the wife of the editor of Nature magazine.
She was the wife of the emeritus editor of Nature, Sir John Maddox, who hired me 33 years ago. Yeah.
Wow. And Nature, through the Macmillan Company that published it, threw out all the papers of Nature magazine from like 1860 something to 19. Yeah. But anyway. Yeah, that's a wonderful book. And Anne Sayer wrote the first biography. Yep. She was Rosalind's friend. It's written in 1975, published by Norton, the same publisher of my book, and very much a feminist account. It's in the middle of the American second wave of feminism. So you see a great deal of that kind of philosophy in it. Yet Anne, like Brenda, interviewed everybody. And they were all living. It was 1975. And so the interviews are files and files, just like Horace Judson's book, The Eighth Day of Creation. He interviewed everybody. So you can, even though those two people are dead and the people you know about are dead, you can still create what I call a historical conversation with that stuff. There are a lot of controversies in there. There are a lot of contradictions. I try to as a judge, I tried to blend it all.
Yeah.
So I went to some, a lot of Myriad archives to find these people's papers.
Yeah.
That's where you find it. That's where you found it. Good stuff.
What did you learn about Rosalind Franklin that you would like readers or people who perhaps haven't read the book to come away with? I'm sure you must have gone in with some ideas and perhaps you were surprised along the way.
Well, I grew to really like her.
Yeah.
I know that sounds weird when you're writing about people you've never met, but it happens to me in almost every book. That there goes my objectivity.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
What's fascinating about her was that my only real encounter was as a reader of what can only be described as a perverse book, because she was already gone. And even in the afterword, he says, well, she really wasn't this way. Well, then why write that book that way? Well, I know why, because most people read the first 160 pages, not the afterword. Yeah. But she was, I don't want to call her difficult, but she was a handful, like a lot of brilliant people are. Yep. She didn't realize, I think, and I find this, this is a very common trait, very brilliant, competent people who things just come naturally to, often when they're younger, don't understand that other people don't have that talent, that gift. It's only when you're dealing with a lot of people over a lot of years and seeing how mediocre the rest of us are that you start to figure that out. So she didn't have a lot of tolerance for people who didn't know what they were doing, like Morris Wilkins. She didn't suffer fools gladly. She had to be, and she knew when she walked in that lab, because she was one of the few women and the only Jewish person there, everything had to be just right. Or as I said, they would have ripped it apart and walked on through it. And they would have. So that was a problem for her, on top of her need to get it right. She was a real data person. Now, in physics at that time, the theoretical physicists, particularly Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, they were like, as I call, they were the surgeons of the hospital, while the data crunchers, they were considered, grunges or drudges. And of course, that's not true. I mean, theory is great, but you got to have data to prove it. And, but that's how Watson and Crick looked at her. And even Crick said, we always tended to condescend to Rosalind. But of course you would have figured out, he said, in a few weeks, just that we figured out first. So I liked her allegiance to data. I loved her family. I love the fact that her friends had a very different experience with her, and she learned how to compartmentalize herself. The funny, warm, thoughtful Rosalind with her friends like Ann Sayre, and the all business, white coat, just the facts kind of person. Plus, she was working with people who didn't treat her very well.
Right.
So by finding her, again, let me just finish one sentence. By finding some of her letters in her own words, particularly when she was at Cambridge at college, I felt like I got to know her better.
Yeah, interesting.
That was the real moment.
Was she a particularly religious person, and how significant was the potential anti-Semitism during the pinnacle of her career?
Well, her father was the president of their synagogue, and he believed and said very much, he was an Englishman first. Three of his grandparents had been born in England. So the Franklin family had been there quite some time and were a prominent Anglo-Jewish banking and publishing family. They were what we call in Ann Arbor Rosh Hashanah Jews. That's people like me who go to the high holidays for synagogue, but not the rest of the year. But certainly was raised in a Jewish home. Whether they kept kosher or not, I didn't ask that, and I need to find out. I doubt it. They're probably Reform Jews. She wrote a wonderful letter as an undergrad that I found to her father, which I highly recommend. Anyone who's a father of a daughter should read this letter, and whatever their particular daughter is up to, they'll say, okay, I get it. And it's an intelligent discussion about his belief in Judaism and a God, and her belief in science. and who is going to add more to society, and who will contribute more, and the differences of the two types of philosophies. And she's 21 years old. It's utterly brilliant, and your heart just melts with that. Yeah. So they were culturally Jewish. It was part of their life, yes.
Right.
And she did, British anti-Semitism was so much more subtle than American anti-Semitism, but it was there. And my favorite evidence of that is George Orwell wrote an article for a British Jewish newspaper in about 1948. So this is after the war. It's after the UN is founded, and it's after it wasn't called yet the Holocaust, but the Nazi atrocities were fully exposed to the world. And still, Orwell said there's more anti-Semitism in Britain, in the British Isles now than before the war. A very telling observation.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, of course, the seminal events of 52 and 53, photograph 51, and the events leading up to the double helix. What are your major takeaways from this? And what is your feeling on there are some who believe that Franklin was just unceremoniously robbed of the appropriate credit at the time by Watson and Crick? Well,
I don't know if it was unceremoniously, but it wasn't exactly a gift from Franklin to Watson and Crick. So it's more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
So to begin, as everyone knows, Watson walked into Wilkins's office with the preprint or the proof of Linus Pauling's paper on the triple helix, and he was overjoyed that he got it all wrong. Wilkins kicked him out, and then he went into Rosalind's pokey little office, which he had never done before, and they were not close. They did not like each other. And he then, she was looking through her microscope at a light box at a diffraction study, and you're literally, you're looking down and you're measuring with probably a little caliper. You have a slide rule. It's very cumbersome. You're measuring in angstroms. It's very tough work. And he burst in. And I don't know if you're this way. I bet a lot of people who are listening to this are the type of researchers, when they are actually in the midst of their work, they're at one with it. And when somebody walks in, I know this is true, it's really jarring.
Yeah.
And that, if you're around science or scholarship, you know that. Okay. So she kicked him out correctly. He said she was going to strike him. She was 5'2" and 120 pounds. He was 6'2". I seriously doubt that. And then he went into Wilkins's office, and Wilkins was so disgusted with her. He had his own set of women problems, by the way, and he froze her out. But he had all of her pictures because she was a postdoc, and the grant and the PI actually owned the data. Okay. Now, Watson's colleagues and supporters say that quite a bit. Well, he didn't steal it. She was shown it, and the lab owned it. That's true. And when Watson, he said this to me, once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And it's really funny because that X cross of 51, that Maltese cross, Wilkins had pictures like that a year earlier and was writing to Shargoff about this. He's drawing it, but doesn't make 1 + 1 didn't equal 2, but Watson right away. But the other part was when he got back to Cambridge and showed this to Bragg and to Peretz. Peretz was also a MRC director of an MRC grant. At Cambridge, they were supposed to be figuring out the structure of myoglobin and hemoglobin. That was their lane. In British science, you did the lane you were in, not other people. So you competed in the lab, but not with a different lab. And the King's College London one was supposed to do DNA. So Peretz showed Crick and Watson the latest interim reports that all the people wrote, and one of them was an 11-paragraph report from Rosalind Franklin that not only had the picture, but the numbers, the mathematical.
Crucially, the numbers, yeah.
The angle of the pitch, all these kinds of things that an X-ray crystallographer does that thank God none of us have to do, because it's really hard work. And you're flying in the night. You don't know what you're seeing till after you see it. So, no, I forgot why I was going to say this.
Well, I was curious if the question was, did you subscribe to?
So
for the argument that Franklin was robbed.
Sorry. I get to these long explanations and I forget why. So here's the point. To begin with,
of course you do.
to begin with, there's no world I know of, then as now, and I talk to ethicists about this, and trust me, as a historian, I've sat in more ethics conferences than I would like to, and there's no ethical contract that when Rosalind Franklin is maybe 100 feet down the hall and there's an open door, and you don't say, "Hey, Rosalind," and I show your pictures to a known competitor. Well, of course you would have said no. And, well, I don't know, but given... Yeah. Let's take that back. I'm pretty sure she would have said no to show it to Watson because she didn't like him very much. But the prudent person would have said no, because why would you show your data to somebody you know is competing with you? For the very issue that So, and also someone who hasn't been very nice to you. But the bigger issue was really when Crick saw that document. That's where he realized about the anti-complementarity of the chains and the pitch and all that. And also that's what proved there was a double helix. Yeah. That those numbers, not the fact that, as Watson said, things come in pairs in biology. So her data was very important, and they were very dismissive in the Nature paper, as you mentioned. A little footnote. It was corrupt. It was perverse to do that when you think about it. And it should be, if life, as I say in the book, if life was fair, it'd be the Watson, Crick, Franklin model. But life isn't fair. Right. Maybe this is not an important question to ask, but I'm just curious. Do you think if she had not died in 1958, but had been alive and still in good health in the early 60s, would she have been invited to Stockholm rather than Wilkins, or how would you have seen that play out? Well, that's the great conclusion of my book. I got into the Nobel Prize archives, which took 2 years and a lot of emails and a lot of... Okay. Their archive is not meant for historians. It's meant for people who are on the Nobel Prize committee, to look at somebody who was maybe nominated a few years ago and is renominated. But if they're 50 years or older, you can look at them. So to put it succinctly, looking at the nomination letters, no, none of these guys nominated her. She was already dead, and nobody was nominating her during her lifetime. But none of them even mentioned her in the letters. And a crystallographer on the Nobel Committee named Arnie Westergren was very good. He knew his stuff. Wrote, "Well, I am hesitant to give the Nobel Prize for two guys who didn't do any data, who didn't, prove it." Now, there's two schools of thought. You could say at the King's group, there was the group led by Wilkins, and he's done an enormous stuff. And of course, Wilkins only did DNA research after that. He did a lot more crystallography work for the rest of his career on DNA. And Westergren did say, but if Rosalind Franklin had been alive, she would have had claim for this. And then it's passed over, you never see it again. Now, she couldn't get the Nobel Prize, as everybody knows, because she was already gone. And you can't get, it's just one of the arcane rules in the will. But it was the Nobel Committee that said she had a claim for it, not the old boys society of physicists and biophysicists and the rest, geneticists, whoever really nominated her. So people like Ann Sayer and Brenda Maddox, she has a life. But I wanted to both explain the science as well as try to uncover some new things. Your book ends with a visit to Jim Watson at his home, I believe. Was that always the plan? Is that how you sort of saw the book playing out? No. Oh, okay. The books I write are never exactly like the proposal I submit. Some of them are vastly different. You can get a lot of trouble for that. Yeah. That's not the book I bought. I once did that with my addiction book. I was going to write about all addictions, and I just focused on cocaine and Freud and William Halsted because it was a better story, and I knew I could get everything in. And my editor, I almost had a heart attack till she read and liked the manuscript. But there's always a change. There's always a change. I interviewed him it was incredible he was incredibly generous to give me a full week, and we spent, every afternoon and had dinners together and lunches. Yeah. Very kind of me. he does articulate racist stuff. Still does. At least he did a few years ago. And
so this was a few years ago, perhaps before the car accident that he was.
Yes, it was actually a few months before the car accident.
Right.
And it was a week after he filmed the American Masters episode on PBS, where he repeated the anti-African-American and racist claims that he said 10 or whatever years earlier, the London Times. Yes.
And his attitude, I'm sure you asked him a lot about Rosalind. What was your takeaway about that exchange?
Well, we had different opinions, to put it politely, but I thought I was really clever. What a good boy am I? And there's still that. I'm old and I'm still a 10-year-old, I think, in my inside. Well, I got the perfect answer question for him, fix it. This was my real, what I really wanted. Well, what if you and Crick were nominated for the Medicine or Physiology Prize, and Wilkins and Franklin got the Physics Prize? Wouldn't have that been? I thought that was a great, it's a hypothetical. You don't lose anything saying, what a good idea. End of the book. No. He got up, and he got up, he stood up. He's not 6'2" anymore, but he still was big. And he looked at me and he said, "You don't get the Nobel Prize for not being able to interpret your own data." And his Nobel Prize was literally behind me, the plaque or the citation.
Right.
Well, yeah, I've met Nobel Prize winners before, but you gotta, okay. And then, I won't tell the very final ending, but he still believes firmly that was the case. He also still firmly believes that Rosalind Franklin was going to strike him. He said that at the age of 90. But I both enjoyed meeting with him because of what I do for a living. And I really wanted to confront him with this because it was troubling me.
Yeah. Well, everyone will have to go get the book to see how that exchange or that visit played out. Just in the last couple of minutes, Howard, you've written many books on many diverse subjects, but one that is particularly germane in the era that we're now in came out in the early 2000s originally, When Germs Travel. It seems as if you were expressing warning signs about imminent pandemics long years before the vast majority of people. Tell us, do you think, tell us about your thoughts about the pandemic and if things could have been done differently?
Well, welcome to my world, because I, for a long time, have been a historical epidemiologist and still do quite a bit of work with the CDC. And we developed here at Michigan with the CDC the whole concept of flattening the curve. And we used 1918 flu data to demonstrate what happened in American cities during the first, second, and third waves and fourth wave. And also how you only have one shot at it, that it was very hard to re-implement social distancing methods. That said, there was a great deal of proof and more proof and more proof. But the idea that something that I helped contribute to that saved literally millions of lives during a pandemic has been the honor of my life. It's just beyond any of my wildest dreams. I'm a historian of medicine. I'm a physician, and that helps. But my impact on people's lives was incredible. My team, everyone, all of us. That makes me feel really good as a doctor.
What are you working on next?
Everyone always asks that. You just finish a book, and it's always for 35 years. What are you working on next? And I always am, because I always start a book right after.
Yeah.
It's my own. I'm working on a book on Darwin. I decided to tackle Mount Everest for the historians of science. He was a great hypochondriac, but he also had a lot of physical maladies. And I want to write about the great monkey debate of 1860 and how he was behind the scenes and Huxley was involved. It's just a short little book, because I will be at Cambridge in a couple of weeks as a visiting professor. So all of his papers are there. And I just sold the book to Norton. You're
going to be a kid in a candy store.
So Norton agreed to publish it, same editor, and I'm delighted because
fantastic. Yeah. Well, I hope
when you get a good editor, saying this to an editor, you hang on for dear life.
Yes. You said your daughters were the inspiration for The Secret of Life. I hope they're happy and pleased and proud and inspired by the result.
I think they are, but I never really know because I'm just dad, you know. You know, you would hope when you walk in, you're like, Dad. No, I'm just Dad.
Yeah. Well, Howard Markel, it's been really a pleasure talking to you. And as we always like to do at the RFS meeting, hearing about the heroine, the great Rosalind Franklin, for whom, of course, the society is named. So our sincere thanks to Howard Markel, author, physician, and historian at the University of Michigan Medical School. His new book is The Secret of Life, Rosalind Franklin, James Watson, Francis Crick, and the Discovery of DNA's Double Helix, published by Norton.
It's the gift that keeps on giving. So it's the holiday season.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Howard. I'm Kevin Davies. Please stay tuned for our next session.